thank you for joining us. It's good to have you with us. We also have Ken on the screen, and I've said it in the session before, but Gabriella, just a reminder to yourself and Ken, it's probably of less importance for Ken because he's here virtually, but this is a public session, so we're doing live streaming of it. And Gabriella told me that she was actually watching the IESBA version online while we were busy with it, so it was a good test. So, Gabriella, thank you for being here. We have agreed when we did the planning for this, and I see you've dealt with that in your slides, that at this session we're going to focus obviously just on, where you probably want to make a few comments because you're in the process of dealing with your sustainability comment letters, but we're going to specifically focus on the firm culture and governance. You said you want to say a little bit just about kicking off the collective investment vehicles. On that one, I'll just remind some of these board members, because they weren't on the board at the time, but when the PI definition was approved, which was the final project under Stavros' leadership, that was the one point that the PIOB made is how do you deal with collective investment schemes and pension funds would be something that need to be revisited, because in the interest of getting that out, and this very important line in the sand of having a PI definition that distinguishes the ethical and independence requirements between auditors of PIs and others, that was why something that stood over. And then, of course, the tax planning, and you said you're doing some outreach already, because that's also a groundbreaking project. So, Gabriella, what I would like to do is, and I'll remind you, we always have a prep session and we just talk about the meeting, our observers give us feedback. We have Tseho online who unfortunately couldn't make it to your meeting, and Robert and Dave stood in for her because of her injury. But we spent some time with them and they gave us feedback. We have a couple of comments that we will raise with you, but we first want to hear from you. I'll raise those comments afterwards and then I'll open it for the observers. So over to you. Thank you for your slides. Thank you for your report, and I'll give you a chance to go through that. And then obviously at the end, or at the end of each session, whatever way you prefer, we can pause and get comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda, and good morning to the PIOB board. Thank you for this opportunity that, as usual, I value very much. It's an opportunity for accountability from the boards, and this is important for us, as well as the feedback and the questions that we always receive from this group. So it's a pleasure, and thank you very much. And yes, Linda, I think it would be preferable to stop after each section and get your comments. I think that that might make the conversation more meaningful and more organized. So I will follow your guidance. On the slides, and before I start, let me just say that they are on purpose a bit short in terms of content and number, because we are at the start of these projects. So instead of giving you a very closed and final idea of what's being done and where we are going, etc., I thought that it was better to keep the conversation open and fluid and give much opportunity for an interactive discussion around the two main topics that we will have on the table, which are firm culture and governance and the CIVs. And finally, in case we have time, and if you're interested, I could also provide a very short debriefing of the early comments that we are having on sustainability, because I listened to the previous session and that could be interesting as well, in case we have time. So it's not on the agenda. So on the agenda we have, I hope we have, okay. From culture and governance, the CIVs project and the tax planning launch, as Linda has just mentioned, and on firm culture and governance. So this is very early days. As you will recall, we decided and make an approval to move forward with this project last December, And we have just had the terms of reference approved last March in our March board meeting. So this is really early days for this project. Additionally, we made an early decision and strategic decision to spend the first year mainly doing research. We are at what we call, or I call, the sponge phase. We are absorbing, we are listening, we are trying to understand, collecting elements, facts, speaking with stakeholders, and that's what's going to keep us busy and awake at night during the first year. That doesn't mean that over this year some of the ideas will not become more concrete and that we will not be making an effort to gradually narrow the scope of this project. This is a big topic, firm culture and governance. It can be everything or anything or nothing. Actually, we are aware of the risks of going too broad and ending up with a handful of nothing. So this will be a very delicate exercise of balancing expectations, not over-promising, not frustrating our stakeholders' expectations as well, getting it right in terms of how we are going to address this topic. But for this, we need to know. I think that as a former regulator and as a current standard setter, I think that one of the bad things or approaches that we can take is to start working before we know what's in it for us, what are the opportunities, what are the gaps, what are the areas where we can be relevant, etc. This takes understanding. And this is the phase where we are in. Some may think that we are going to take too much time, that 1 year is a too long time to come up with some conclusions, and our expectations and our goal is that by the end of this year, the working group will provide the board with some recommendations. But I will just recall that there were other projects where this research period or this fact-finding period, as you want to call it, took much longer than 1 year. This is a very complex and a very difficult project. I'm not going to call it a project yet, work stream, and we need to make sure that we won't move forward before we know everything that we need to know and before we listen to our stakeholders as much as we should be listening. So what you have in these two slides, and I can move them, but they are a little bit more of the same. It's a list of potential areas of inquiry. We approved the terms of reference in March, but we also had 4 external presentations, and for some of you who might have watched the board meeting, or at least that first day of the board meeting, you may have noted that we had 4 external presentations from 4 completely different presenters, academics, regulators, consultants, etc., which I think were extremely rich in terms of content, in terms of the different perspectives they brought to the table. And this allowed the board to start a conversation and a discussion around some of the topics which will clearly be at least areas of focus for us. What we are going to do with these areas of focus and these topics, this is still unclear by this time. We may end up starting a project, a standard setting project to amend the code, adjust the code, develop new standards. It can be 1 project or 2 projects or 3 projects or no project at all if we come to the conclusion that what we have to do is something different. Definitely, apart from drafting standards and developing standards, which of course can be one of the results of this project, what we really need and want at this stage is to launch the discussion, to make the IESBA become and be also a platform to facilitate the discussion, awareness raising, etc., between the the different stakeholders around this topic of firm culture and governance. And what I can tell you from these first 3 months three first months of the year is that the topic is raising an incredible level of attention and interest from all stakeholders groups, from regulators, from the firms themselves, from others who are not regulators nor the firms, but are curious to see what's going to come out from this project. So we are under significant scrutiny, I would say. Expectations are high. They are not necessarily aligned. I think that there are different expectations from different stakeholder groups that we will have to manage as well. But the question about whether it was really this strategic topic that we had identified for 2024, 2027, if this was really a topic that we should address, 3 months after we are more, our conviction is higher than it was 3 months ago, given the impact that this is making. In the many outreach activities and initiatives that we are going through, which were mostly dedicated to the sustainability exposure draft and the launch, the early conversation about the launch of the tax planning standards, stakeholders want to speak about firm and culture and governance. That's the topic that they want to address now, which is a bit difficult, I must say, for us, given the early phase and stage where we are in. So we should be careful about not promising that we are going to do this or that, not go beyond what the working group is doing and what the board has decided, but definitely the level of excitement around the topic is, on the one hand, very reassuring. On the other hand, very challenging, because we know the level of scrutiny and expectations around the topic. Now, I don't know, I think that you may have taken a look on the slides on the potential areas of inquiry, which were at the same time the topics that were mostly on the basis of the presentations that were made last March. There are some interesting topics, and I can go through some of them. Who is the true client? And this topic came up mostly when discussing the situations where the tax planning providers are providing services to governments and other official public authorities. The issues and the challenges created by the international nature of the firms, the matter of the incentives, and here we are coming to a very critical topic, which is, sorry for the word, it's about money, and it's about how money drives a lot of decisions, business models, and some issues inside the firms. The calibration and the challenges in the weight between consulting and audit services provided by the same entities, transparency mechanisms for sure, and some governance topics which are not explicitly mentioned on these slides, but which of course were discussed and will be on our radar screen and under our attention. One of the questions that was surely debated was the structure of the firms, whether this structure, the typical structure of the firms could look a bit different so as to avoid a few problems, etc. So we have all and everything inside this project. We have governance issues, we have transparency issues, we have issues related with the structure of the firms, with the model, the business model of the firms. But above all, we have a question about ethical behaviors within the firms and what's driving some unethical behaviors. That was the basis and the start of our reflection. And I had the opportunity already to explain this to this group, what made us as a board decide to, or what made us identify this firm culture and governance topic as a strategic topic for the next strategic cycle, was the consideration that even if there is a lot of regulation all over, trying to respond to the problems that we have seen with audit services, accounting firms, etc., since the start of the century, and if you think there was Enron, Parmalat, WorldCom, and a lot of regulation. We had Dodd-Frank, we had the Sarbanes-Oxley, etc. And then a little bit later, a bunch of additional problems, and new regulation trying to respond, namely the European audit framework and all these things, and then a new series of problems. So what is missing? What's happening that makes it necessary to think about these problems probably from a different perspective? And our conviction is what's necessary and where the problems lies and where it is necessary to do something is on firms' culture and governance. This is what has not still been addressed, possibly in the way it should be addressed, and where we, as an ethics board, may have some responsibilities and the duty, at least, to consider to do something. So these many areas, governance, transparency, structure, business models, incentives, etc., they are all part of the same problem, and the problem that we see there is the issue to which we are aiming to provide some responses is the influence that the firm's culture and governance has on unethical behaviors causing a lot of problems. So that's where we are. We are already aware that we will have to make some strategic options on what to address and what not to address, or if I may say it better at this stage, what to address first or at an earlier stage, and what we should leave for a later stage of this project or never, depending on the conclusions to which we will come by the end of this year. For sure, issues related with governance and transparency will be on our radar screen and will be under our attention. This is probably, and I'm saying probably because we haven't finalized the analysis nor anything close to that, but probably governance and transparency are the issues that we can address within the existing framework and structures. We can't dream of changing the world of the firms in one day, if ever, and if even we should, but we can surely look at what exists and see what we as an ethics board can do within the existing structures and models and etc. And that will be for sure our first priority. There can be other things that this board can do, we don't know. We have to discuss and see first if it's in our scope and remit and mandate or not. And secondly, we have to understand that there are some areas, namely related with structures of the firms, which may involve a significant regulatory contribution. Things that the IESBA can't do and should not do, but which are mostly for the regulators to do. Of course, we can do, and we should do, something which is to launch the discussion, bring regulators, bring everybody into the discussion. But we have to separate things, and we have to separate the phases of the projects above all, and see what we can do at an early stage within the existing framework. This is, I think I may say, and I don't want to go beyond the thinking of the working group and of the board itself, because again, the discussion, it's very early days in the discussion, but I think that I can already say something like this. We will probably agree on doing what is possible within the existing firm's structure, firm's business models, etc. And what we can do is to probably make the changes or propose the changes or whatever that will, in our view, be able to raise the bar in ethical behavior within the existing structure. And then we can start a discussion about other things, just like we are starting the discussion on the expansion of the scope of the code, where we can't do things all alone and we have to wait for the others, for the regulators and the corporate governance community to come in. So areas like partnership structures versus corporate structures and etc., we can have a lot of ideas on that. We can have a lot of opinions, but we also have to have clear that any possible transition may face significant obstacles and difficulties at the jurisdictional level, and that regulators will be the ones who will have a say on that. So this will be for sure a phased approach. We don't want to delay too much in terms of what our vision and strategy is. We definitely don't want to delay too much our action and coming up with proposals, results, etc. But these have to be realistic in terms of what the IESBA as an ethics standard setting board can do within the existing framework, without precluding the possibility of, in the future, doing something more. So I think that I'll stop here, not before saying that if I can identify the topics that will for sure be subject to an early work from this working group and from the board, are areas regarding best practices on ethical behavior, transparency, and governance. This will be for sure what will keep us awake at night over the first year and the first times. And I think with this, I would stop here and see if there are any comments or questions on these considerations.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. This is a very important project. It is again breaking new ground, and we've seen all these things happening in the external landscape, as you also referred to. It's I like your analogy of you're in the sponge phase of it, because I think the sponge phase also means it's a little bit of drinking from a fire hose. You know, there's just so much happening, and the regulatory landscape in this area is, you know, very different. So I think it's going to be a challenging project. Your comments around what it is that you can do and what you can do that can sensibly be implemented in this very vast and different and changing regulatory landscape. I think that's a really important comment, because it doesn't really help if you set standards and, you know, that are really good, but it's not being implemented anyway. So that's going to be very interesting for us to also see how you phase it. As you said, the obvious first things around transparency and so on. So we're really looking forward to seeing that. I just on the regulatory and the external landscape, it is so forever changing. We were talking when we prepared for the session about now you also have firms that are going into sort of the private equity space, where they're private equity investors. It's a very, so the talking about firm structure, the shareholder structure of firms are changing and so on. I think it's going to be hard, but it is really important. We've seen lots of things that go wrong, potentially because of some of these things, combination of culture or governance, or maybe the governance should be moved forward towards, you know, some of the corporates or listed corporates in the governance. So very interesting project for us, very important, definitely something that we as a board in our, you know, just in our thinking and sharing some thoughts and so on, are spending time to also get to a better understanding of what's happening out there and what really are the public interest issues. There's no doubt that this is in the public interest to give, as you said, at least in some instances, some guardrails around some of these really important aspects. And I would say lastly, the stepped approach of let's break this into sizable chunks that can have, you know, you can get things out and have an impact is really important. It's very early in the project, so we obviously don't really have any comments of substance other than to wish you well, to support you, and to say we really do believe this is important, and we are looking forward to seeing how this evolves over time. I have one card from Janine, and then I think thereafter we can go on to the next topic. We'll deal with, maybe I'll take both of the comments from Janine and from Tom, and then we'll go on. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriela, for your introduction of this very important project. And you said the focus of the project is what is driving an ethical behavior in the firms, which is, I think, the good starting point. And then you end up with all these aspects that you need to consider with the board. And that triggered me because if I think about the focus and about behaviors, in the code there is this conceptual framework with the fundamental principles, and it's actually striking that these fundamental principles, they're 5, and they're actually encompass so much. If everyone would comply with them, keep them, act upon them, there wouldn't be so many of these issues. And also, in my view, acting upon these fundamental principles, it's actually a prerequisite for audit quality, because there's always this link with competence and those kind of elements and integrity and so on. So I was wondering whether also, based on what I often noticed in practice, is that professional accountants are very much like also focusing at specific requirements, also in the code, directly going to the independence parts and to comply with those, but not necessarily thinking from this conceptual framework in the first place. What kind of threats are there in my, or in the firm, or when you're a leader of the firm? And that's maybe also an angle that you could maybe look at. How could that conceptual framework with these fundamental principles that are so foundational actually, how could that be more strengthened actually, or somehow get more focus and be more of the first step in everything? Thank you.
Thanks, Janine. Tom?
Thank you very much, Chair. And I would like to first thank you for your broadening the outreach activity for not limited to the English-speaking world, but come to Japan and see what happens in Japanese firms' culture and governance as well. Thank you for that. I have a very small question concerning the term of reference. Originally, it referred to so-called the profit-driven culture in the section C, focus. But then the section C was deleted. So there is no mention to the profit-driven culture in the terms of reference. What is the background, or what is the thinking of the board concerning that sort of deletion? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Linda, if I may. Responding to Janine, this is music to my ears. How can we make the foundational principles become more relevant? That's my question since day one of my term. The principles are there, and what sometimes strikes me is that we have the material, and the question is how to bring the material to a stage, a level of recognition, awareness, implementation, and compliance, which would completely change the picture. So this is behind our thinking when we say, well, let's see what we have to do with the code. Do we have to develop a set of new standards? Do we have to make changes? Or is it also or mainly about bringing what already exists to a different level, involving the regulators, making it relevant, etc.? And with that, let me just share a little bit of our dialogue or experience, and I'll have more to say in 1 year, in 1 month, but with Australia, where they are gradually starting to look at what the IESBA has and asking, and I think that they are closer now than they were 1 or 2 months before, asking, couldn't this be the response? I mean, of course, adoption with amendments, with a lot of adjustments and etc. But I really think and believe that we have the response for many of these problems. The question and the problem is that that product is not at the level of recognition, awareness, and adoption as it should be. It's a matter of implementation and effective implementation. And that's where the regulators have a responsibility, because, I mean, I'm not saying that we should be aside and neglect that part of the implementation of adoption, and we have our role to play there. But there's a role to be played by everybody, by the regulators, by the companies themselves, which should be the first ones to require strong, robust, ethical baselines for the ones providing auditing and for the repairs and etc. So yes, you are right. The independent standards are more recognized because it's really about compliance. And because in some parts of the world there are very strong and well-defined mandatory frameworks, as is the case in Europe and in other places. With ethics, things are a little bit less well-defined, well-framed. And I think that the big challenge that we, and when I say we, it's the IESBA, the PIOB, the system, everybody has ahead of us is to make the ethics code with the necessary adjustments that we will be always undertaking, become something different than just a nice to have. It's nice to have it, but let's put it in practice. And I tell you that something will change. We tested, and we tested that with the Australian authorities, if the IESBA ethics code, the principles, the fundamental principles of the code had been observed by those who did what we know they did. Nothing would have happened. So, and we would not need new standards or additional requirements or whatever. It was just a matter of complying and observing the fundamental principles and the conceptual framework, and nothing would have happened. So I'm happy to hear that, Janine, because it's really the question behind this, and that's also why I'm saying that we don't know yet what this project is, this work stream is going, where it is going to land, and we are not promising that this is going to be a big project of standard setting. Most of all, and above all, I think that our responsibility is to bring the discussion to the table and to involve stakeholders and see what's in it for all of us, and not only for the IESBA, although we are ready to do what we need to do. So I don't know if I responded, but that's what I can say. Tom, thank you for your question. So I think that you told me that you observed the part of the meeting where we discussed the terms of reference. And I think that in a nutshell, where the board landed was in the need to leave it as open as possible, because we don't have any certainties at this time. And we would be shooting our own feet if we were to narrow it by narrow the terms of reference in terms that we could not take or make different decisions in the future. There was a discussion about ethical culture, ethical governance. Is governance which drives culture, or is culture which drives governance? And I think that the board, I'm sure that the board preferred not to make any commitment in that respect and not to take any specific direction, because we need to have, we need that freedom, this freedom of thinking, observing and thinking free about how this is going to develop. So the terms of reference, I recognize that they don't say much about what we are going to do and what our mindset is, apart from saying we are concerned and we are open to do something. It's on purpose, after the discussion that the board held, on purpose left very open to make anything fit into those terms of reference. Otherwise, we might be forced to change them in 6 months or something like that, which should not be very good. So it's preferable to leave it open. And that deletion, I think it was part of this strategic vision. That mention was already giving some signs about a certain approach that we prefer not to commit to at this stage.
Thank you. I've got one more card from Dave. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, Chair, and Gabriella, thanks for that summary of where you're headed with this. I think this is really important, and I mostly just want to make a comment because you mentioned some examples, but we have plenty of examples of unethical behavior, and some that I find most egregious is cheating on ethics exams, for example, and those sorts of things, which is just sort of raises the question: is the code really, is there a deficiency in the code which we should ask, and if need be, we should update it. but there's a human nature aspect to this that really needs to be recognized. And maybe if there's something to be added, it's in that understanding why does in light of a code that already addresses these sorts of things, does this continue to persist? And so I think this is probably one of the more difficult areas to address because of that human nature aspect. And not to well, I will repeat what Linda said. I think there, in addition to those past examples that we have of unethical behavior, I think future threats like the change in ownership and investment in firms and that sort of thing, what sort of incentives will that create that may be counter to ethical behavior are really important to try to anticipate to make sure that we've got a robust framework. So good luck with all of this. I'm looking forward to it.
And maybe just to add to that, Gabriella, you referred to the Australian inquiry, and you would know that was one of the comments you spoke about. Some of this, the behavioral aspect is the very important role of policymakers to play. What's the consequence management of poor behavior? You would know, I made the comment to the Australian committee that we already have good, strong standards on the ethics side and on the ISA side. It's because it was my impression that their thinking was we've now gone through this reform process and now it's coming out of the starting blocks, which is not the case with the standards. We've got long-standing, robust standards, but you made the point on the implementation and how is it implemented, how is it interpreted, and the very important role of the regulatory community to hold people responsible. The other point that I made to that commission or committee was that it's not useful to move away from international standards. We're working with global network firms, and it's very important that there's a level of consistency when it comes to how things are done. And the last point possibly is, it was my understanding and just some of the comments made that maybe some of the thinking was, should we go to audit firm only practices and move away from, firms where there's also advisory arms, which we just caution them to think carefully about that because of the importance of getting, especially in where we are now in the world of sustainability reporting, that diversified set of skills. And I do believe, I used the mining example because I've got a little bit of experience in that, and I know it's something that that's very important in Australia as well. You can't even do a mining audit without having specialist skills when it comes to valuations and geologists and so on, never mind a sustainability assurance report. So I do believe some of those comments are really important. Some of those link very much into, some of the work that you're going to have to think about in this project. It's a very important project. So thank you for that. I'm going to go to Paul. Oh, I've got to go to Paul Philippe, and then Gabriella, I'll let you wrap up on this topic that we can move on. Paul?
Thanks, Linda. Just following up on Dave's point, which I think is a really important one, is we're dealing with individuals, and there are going to be instances of bad actors. I mean, I think that's just the reality of the world, as disappointing as those things might be to all of us. But I do think that a huge data point is how a firm responds in the face of that. If you look at the Australia situation, for example, I have read, and I don't know any more details than what's in the public domain, but I've read criticisms that the firm engaged in some kind of an investigation, but has been unwilling to publicly disseminate the results of that investigation. I'm aware of a firm in the U.S. that was sanctioned because it engaged in bid rigging, and the individual who was responsible for leading that bid rigging effort got moved out of direct audit responsibilities into, quote, business development. Those don't sound like reactions from a firm that is dedicated to a high ethical culture. So I think thinking about how a firm responds to circumstances where they have ethical breaches by members of the firm is a really important part of how you can observe and drive improvements in cultures. I think that's a really important part of the process.
Thanks, Paul. Philippe?
Thank you. Gabriela, thank you for the presentation and the opening.
Philippe, just get close to your mic, please, else people can't hear you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. For ethical aspects, the question of ethics, and when I hear the conversation, there is something which really hits me. It's the fact that implicitly there is a sort of unconscious consensus that, you know, ethical behavior or unethical behavior is something which is obvious. And so my question is about the fact that, you know, based on my personal experience as in charge of ethics, of business ethics in an international group present in 50 countries around the world, there is absolutely no consensus on ethical values throughout the world. And there are billions of people who do not accept, you know, the ethical values reference, which are familiar, you know, in our Western, let's say, global culture. Let me give you a simple example, which is loyalty, for example. Loyalty, you know, it's something which is very critical in terms of independence for the audit activity. Because if you are too much loyal, you know, you lose your independence in some key cases. But in some parts of the world, for some billions of people, loyalty is a fundamental value. So my question is that it's simple, that if you transform ethical matters in standards and rules, you only have, you know, compliance issues at stake. So you can develop a firm throughout the world with very specific processes and standards and have control, you know, processes to say you have to act this way in compliance with the rules. But if you move to I wouldn't say regulation, but the expectation of behaviors based on values, you open, you know, a possibility of deviation, variations in good faith for some, you know, cultures who do not recognize or understand, you know, the contents of the values the same way that we do. So how do you contemplate dealing with that, with the risk of promoting a set of values which is not recognized by half of the world, or how are you dealing with that?
Thank you, Gabriela. And then you can close up on this topic, then we can move on. Thanks. After that easy question.
Okay, so I think that there was only one question from Philippe, and the others were more comments, but let me just refer to some of the topics that you mentioned. One is the need to address the others, not only auditors and audit, but other services and other providers, just like you mentioned, Linda. And I think that Dave's comments was also a little bit in that respect. And of course, this is in on our radar screen, because this is also one of the other strategic topic of our next strategic cycle. So the two topics that we identified, which is firm culture and governance, and exploring the possible application of the code to others than practitioners or auditors or accountants, they are intimately related. And This is clearly, for instance, what they are looking for in Australia. And I'm mentioning Australia because it's a public case, and it's because, and it's not because we are being driven by what's happening in Australia, but it's really a case study, and what's happening there and the developments there and the responses they are looking for are very interestingly meeting our own vision about where we should go. So providing a response which is both viable for auditors and accountants, but also for others providing the same services, be them in the firms or even outside, but at least in the same firms. It's, of course, a matter of concern for us. What we need is to come up with something, be it whatever it can be, that is something for all of them in the same firm. And here I'm responding to Paul. How do the different members of the firm react in face of the problems? They should all not react, act according to the same principles, according to the same code in lato sensu, according to the same rules, okay, according to the same expected behaviors. And this is truth from a top-down perspective, as the other way around is truth, because at the top level, it should be absolutely irrelevant whether the top management or the managing partner or whatever, it's an accountant or not an accountant. The expected behaviors and the ethical culture of the firm should apply to both exactly in the same way. And we know that there are different approaches, and we heard, for instance, the new chair of the FRC, of the UK FRC, complaining that they don't have the tools because most of the people that they should be addressing are not accountants, and they don't have the powers for that. So this is about trying to develop an approach which is applicable to everybody inside the firm. Now, how they react, yes, it's a problem, because sometimes there is an early notice that, or understanding, or intuition, or whatever, that there is a problem, and the delay in solving the problem just makes the problem much bigger. That early action from the firm itself to try to address the problem is something that should be should be given a strong incentive, because the problems will become a much smaller and easier to solve. Now, to your question, Philip, I think that is the existential problem of the IESBA, not for this project, but for our life. How can we speak about ethical principles and values which apply everywhere? And this is what we are dealing with in every project, anything that we do. It's always the same problem. Now, we make a difference, if this is possible, and if you allow me, about what we call soft ethics and hard ethics. Soft ethics is, your values, my values, my religion, your religion, something that is very dependent on your own approach to ethics, to values, to a lot of things, which are very much dependent on your culture, on your education, etc. But it is our conviction that it is not only possible, absolutely necessary, to set up a benchmark according to which every, in this case, accountant should abide by. Hard ethics, it's what we call hard ethics, something which is should be the common framework, very understandable and very objective, that should rule the conduct and the behavior of the accountants, irrespective of the culture, irrespective of the individual options, etc. Now, your point is, so your approach is about compliance only. I wouldn't say that. If you think, for instance, about what we are doing on tax planning, and we are going to speak about that a little bit later, in tax planning, our point is exactly, this is beyond compliance. This is beyond making sure that the law is complied with. You have to put some ethical thinking, and the trigger to decide whether a behavior is ethical or unethical in this context is the public interest. That's the element and the criteria against which it has to be tested, and again against which it has to be decided beyond the law, because it can be legal but be actually unethical. If even being legal, it harms the public interest in a way that it should not be accepted. More objective than this, it's difficult. Of course, this is the inherent integral difficulty of ethics, and it's why so many people, even regulators and policymakers, step away because they think it's extremely difficult, almost impossible. But there must be a baseline which should be common to everybody, like in other areas of life where there are some values which are not subject to calibration. They are almost absolute, and which are in this area absolutely necessary to make sure that not only international firms, which they are the ones at least where the big problems come from, have something which a common language, a common set of principles, a common set of rules, if it's the case, that make them recognize and understand what are the expected behaviors, irrespective of whether you are providing services in Thailand, in Laos, or in the United States. Your question is more than relevant, but this is not a specific problem of this project. I think it's the problem, our existential problem as a ethics standard setting board.
We need to move on to the next topic. Begonia, can I ask you, let's just see if we can have some time at the end for this. Let's just first cover the other topics, because else we're not going to get to them, if you don't mind. And then if we have some time left, we'll pick that up. So do you want to talk about collective investment schemes? Thanks, Gabriela.
Yes, Linda, I do. Thank you very much. So this is the timeline and the way forward that I have mentioned already, so I'm not going to spend time there. So on CIVs. Just to give a very brief context for this project, in 2021, I think the IESBA made a proposal on the PI definition. This is to be very short, and after some discussions with the stakeholders, the PIOB, research, and etc., it was decided to leave the CIVs and pension funds out of the scope, out of the PI definition, considering the very, very, very diverse nature and relevance of these structures around the world, which should put a very, very relevant problem to the regulators and policymakers and legislators in deciding what would be scoped in and scoped out. But the IESBA committed to the PIOB and stakeholders in general to do some additional work in this respect, mainly to test the existing standards against the need to have a robust framework for CIVs and pension funds with respect, namely, to the notions of related entity, the related entity definition, and check if the independence provisions in the code were fit for purpose and sufficient, appropriate for CIVs and pension funds. This project has been a little bit delayed in face of the urgencies of the sustainability. This was not agreed, but it was clearly stated here at the PIOB, but it was time to move forward, and that's what we are doing now. Let me tell you that this is the first staff-driven. I'm always looking for the word because, well, staff-led, staff-based, staff-driven model. It's the first staff-driven model project, entirely relying on a working group formed by IESBA staff members, but of course with an interaction with the board, for which we have identified one specific board member who is more, familiar with this very complex topic, who is constantly providing feedback and being used as a sounding board and as an advisor as well, etc. So since December 2023, when we approved the project, to move forward with the project, the working group has been mostly running and conducting desktop research to understand the diversity of structures in the different investment schemes. It was not possible, of course, to cover all the jurisdictions and all the CIV structures, but for the time being, they focused mostly on structures, typical structures on the United States, South Africa, and UK. These were the jurisdictions addressed until now. They will have to move very quickly dive into the European framework, which is an important one, namely with the UCITS and IFND frameworks, which are used by other jurisdictions in other parts of the world. For instance, the UCITS, it's a label which is very known and imported by Hong Kong and many Asian countries. So what we aim at is to make a holistic, to have a holistic review of the CIVs and the pension funds, as well as on investment companies' complexes, which may require, according to the research and analysis done so far, may require some adjustments and enhancements in the Code of Ethics to cover reality and some structures which to which the code is currently not exactly fit for purpose, because there are some missing concepts and definitions and some realities which have to be addressed. So the big question here is whether the code adequately addresses independence in audits of complex investment vehicles and pension funds. And the problem is this one, which is described there. Currently, the Code of Ethics mandates independence from the audit client, irrespective of who the client is. And it is defined, the client is defined as an entity in respect of which a firm conducts an audit engagement. This reality of the CIVs and the relationships that they maintain, they keep with investment advisors, investment managers, fund managers, trustees, etc., is absolutely critical to determine if these third parties might create, or the relationship with these third parties might create some independence threats, and if these threats are adequately addressed by the existing provisions in the code. This is the subject and the scope of the work that is being that will be developed by the working group. Here you have potential concerns coming that are driving this exercise. That I'm not going through these examples, but the questions are always, given the specificity of the structure of CIVs and pension funds and the specificity of the relationships in which they enter with advisors, managers, trustees, etc., does the code currently address the possible threats to independence in an appropriate way, or does it need some fit-for-purpose standards or provisions to address these specificities? That's what we are trying to understand. On the next steps for this project, we will, the working group will continue the desktop research, extending it to other jurisdictions, as I said, namely to include Europe in the analysis. And the plan is to organize as many outreach opportunities, namely some workshops and discussions with relevant stakeholders to explore regulatory approaches to independence, potential gaps, etc., that we may need to address, and that may take us to decide to take some action in terms of enhancing the code or including new provisions in the code. So in May 2024, early May, we will have our meeting with the national standard setters, and we expect to have good feedback in that respect. Let me tell you that this is not an easy project in terms of relationship with stakeholders, because it's a very, very specific area where even the practitioners, many of them are not very familiar. So we need to target the right people and the right stakeholders to get meaningful input, because otherwise we risk to have some inputs or some considerations which do not take into consideration the very specific nature of the structures we are speaking about, and the very specific nature of the threats that may arise from these CIVs and pension funds structures. So here you have so this is on tax planning. So this is the next steps. In June, we expect to have another presentation from the working group covering other geographic areas and the analysis that they are doing on other jurisdictions and the structures, the frameworks therein, and to have something until the end of the year in terms of recommendations to the board about what to do and, if necessary, which changes should be considered in the code to address this topic.
Thank you, Gabriella, and we're looking forward to this. If I just sort of take one step back and before we go on to tax planning, I remember at the time when the PIOB was quite concerned with the definition, the PI definition excluding pension funds and collective investment schemes, but the very strong argument, and I think all of us have seen that in our different jurisdictions, is one pension fund is not the same as the other. It's really the scalability issue and how do you get the big ones in. I know at the time the task force did a little bit of work to get an understanding in some of those countries just what the population of pension funds and investment schemes look like, because some of them are closed funds, which might just be an employer with its 10 or 100 or 1,000 workers, and if there's not an audit requirement, do you even now have to have a PI definition on top of it? So I think the challenge probably in this project is going to be how do you get the big ones into the PI definition and how do you distinguish between big and small, because you probably, again, don't want to overstretch or what regulators decided in some countries are in and out of certain regulations, and then that the audit regulation or the audit and ethics requirements go beyond that when it comes to, because the factor is really around non-audit services and the NAS requirements. So it's an important project, interesting one, and scalability and getting the right line in the sand is going to be very interesting and difficult. We wish you luck with that. Do you want to talk about tax planning and your thinking around outreach? Oh, apologies, Robert.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Gabriella, for the outline of the work that's going to be done on this project. Just going back to the history of how this happened, which Linda and I were involved in at the time with your predecessor. This is a very good case study, I think, of developing a public interest response to a particular project, because the way the discussion happened at the time was that the IESBA considered that these areas of complexity, jurisdictional complexity that Linda has just referred to, made it difficult to include these categories of entities in the primary definition of the PI, which was being considerably extended beyond just the listed entity focus that it had previously. And where the code landed at that point was actually to include reference to these pension funds and collective investment vehicles, but in what was termed at the time a bottom-up approach. So it enabled jurisdictions, when adopting the new PI definition, to consider broadening the application of the definition in their particular jurisdiction. So we were aware, for example, in Canada, from our former Canadian member, Karen Stothers, who was a member of the board at the time, and there would have been significant practical issues in terms of bringing pension funds into the primary definition. But in my own jurisdiction in New Zealand, we already had pension funds in our PI definition, and what we were able to do at our standard setting board, which I also chaired at that time, was to review the new provisions, and we reaffirmed that in the New Zealand context, pension funds and collective investment vehicles should remain within our PI definition. So that flexibility is still there. And so I think this additional work is really helpful in that respect, and that's a context which I think is very important to keep in mind from the public interest perspective, that we're dealing with the public interest not only at a jurisdictional level but also in terms of the global definitions. And I do endorse First of all, the focus on non-assurance services, I think that's absolutely right. The hosting example is a very good one. There's an analogy with where the board landed with some of the technology NAS provisions around hosting technology provisions, for example, in the audit firm as a NAS. So it'd be quite useful perhaps to draw those in. And for the reasons that I've suggested, the last point that's on the screen there, very important to talk with the national standard setters, and I think to get some indication from them, and I'm sure my own jurisdiction will volunteer what they did, that processes I've outlined it, but other jurisdictions as well doubtless will have views about where there's a clear pathway to adoption, to bringing them in at this stage, and where the challenges and the roadblocks are for them, and that will be helpful for your staff as they continue to develop the project. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. That was a really good reminder as well. Thank you. Gabriella, thank you. Let's talk about tax planning.
Yes, sure. But just 30 seconds before I move to the tax planning, to make sure that it is clear that the idea of this CIV's project is not to reopen the discussion around PI definition. It's stable, it's still being implemented, but it's to help to help everybody with a possible fit-for-purpose provisions with respect to these very specific structures. So, thank you very much. Thank you. So, on tax planning, the tax planning standards will be subject to the PIOB consideration tomorrow, I think, I don't know, but, well, I hope. And we are, of course, preparing for the rollout, assuming that, as we have to, that there will be successful certification of the standards. Anyway, we had to start earlier. So what we are doing is to plan the rollout and outreach plan, just like the PIOB has always been recommending that we do. It's not easy. We have the sustainability exposure draft out, requiring a lot and immense effort from the IESBA in terms of outreach and the communications and etc. And so these two things are overlapping and creating a real stretch, but it's what we have to do. It is what it is. So I must say that we have probably already started, and just to mention the last week's outreach in Canada, we had a seminar organized by CPA Canada on tax, with a lot of attendance and very substantial comments, most of them very positive, some of them, a few of them a little bit less positive, but it is how it usually goes. So we are positive about this, and then after the launch day, which is foreseen for April 15, subject of course to PIOB certification, we are preparing a lot of materials to roll out these standards. Videos in different languages, just like we did with the sustainability exposure draft, an infographic that we are discussing these days, and fact sheets, trying to make it simple and understandable. At the same time, I'm making some interviews with some media like Financial Times, Bloomberg, tax analysts, Le Monde, etc. All of them scheduled for this week, which makes my life not necessarily easier, but it has to be before the launch, of course. So we are preparing also some media journalists and some journalists to be able to speak about the standards if they want to. And there are some global webinars also being prepared and staff FAQs. So a lot of work in terms of making sure that after the 15th of April, the standards will be out and will be understood. And that there will be the necessary awareness created. We will be, I will be there will be seminars, webinars, outreach activities, etc. April and May. And in May, and I'm going to move to the next slide, there will be an important outreach activity in Australia, which will also, but not only, cover the tax planning standards. And you have a list there of some of the moments where we will be able to speak about these tax planning standards. Interestingly enough, and even if tax is a very sensitive topic nowadays in Australia, they want to speak about firm culture and governance. It was not our offer, it was their request. Everybody wants to speak about firm culture and governance, so we will balance our contribution. Same in Japan, where we will take the opportunity in our very many outreach opportunities to speak about the sustainability, tax sustainability, exposure draft, tax planning, ethics standards, and also we got a request to speak about firm culture and governance as well, so we will try to make the best out of our time and make sure that we address all the topics with the stakeholders. Interestingly, we understood that Japan already has a governance code for audit firms, which is something that will be of interest for us as well. So Australia is going to be a very important moment and opportunity in that respect, but that won't stop there. The IESBA will be featuring in a conference in London in 2 weeks. It's not going to be me. I mean, it's impossible for me to be there, but Jens Paul, who is also participating in this rollout process, of course, as a former board member and former chair of the task force, will assume that conference. And yes, so we are preparing. It's with a LinkedIn press release, etc., all the materials and meetings being set up to make sure that the rollout goes well, and that what we have to do, we do it.
Thank you for that, and it is a really important project to do outreach because it is so fundamental and new. Our session is actually immediately after the coffee break at 12:30, so you can sit in as an observer if you want to, Gabriella, to see how the certification goes. At the same time, we will also be looking at the 2 strategies and work plans. Maybe just one comment from my side, and then I'll hand over to Robert, and that is just, we absolutely also am conscious of the fact that somewhere similar to the PI definition, somewhere you have to draw a line in the sand to say, okay, we're now getting this out. And I almost want to call it the impact study, the post-implementation review that you're going to pick up in about 3 years or so from now will be really relevant and important. There will probably be a bit of discussion as the standard gets implemented. It's in 2025, if I recall. It would be interesting to see if it actually is achieving those public interest objectives or criteria that you set out, because it's such a new and important standard. So we will be looking forward to when we get there to see that. And I think this level of outreach is important to already flag that and to say, this is what we're trying to achieve. We do need to hear from you over time whether this is actually forthcoming. I'm going to take all the comments at once and then go back to you, because I know you want to make a few remarks on sustainability and okay, yeah. Hopefully we get if there's anything that you want to raise, hopefully we have 5 minutes left at the end to talk about that. I'm going to start here with Robert and then go to Janine and then go to the other side. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you, Chair, and I'll be brief in relation to this. I was the observer of the session where the rollout program was presented to the board at the meeting. I just wonder, Gabriella, whether it might be helpful in the context of talking about the post-implementation review, which is, we've noted at our meeting, is not on your strategic work plan for 2024 to 27, but understanding that the implementation date for the new standard is not until 2025, and so perhaps it would come into the next strategic cycle. But I think it would just be helpful for the board to, within that context, just to get to hear from you about the question which is often raised in relation to this project about how the ethical principles and the standards which are being developed for professional accountants providing tax advisory services are expected to be socialised with other professions, particularly the legal profession. I know that Professor Poll has had that in his sights throughout his work as the task force chair, and he did indicate that at the board meeting that this will continue to be part of his focus as as a consultant to assist the rollout. So I wonder if you could just comment on that. And if I could just make an observation as well, that I think, as I said in my observation remarks at the time, that last point that's on the slide there is very important, because since this project has moved on, where just that first discussion about firm culture and governance focused on the questions about how a firm's governance arrangements are equipped and have the capacity and the ability to respond to something that's happening within the firm that's going wrong. And we know from the tax planning work that, of course, tax planning work can go on over a number of years. Tax strategies that a firm can be advising on, they can develop, and they can go off the rails slowly. And there was a lot of very valuable discussion, wasn't there, in the session on, particularly with the Australian Tax Deputy Commissioner, about the importance of the firm culture and governance being able to pick up and respond to a piece of tax planning advice of that nature which is going wrong. So I just think it's very important to, as you are conducting this outreach, just to make it clear to everyone that you are thinking about these issues more broadly already.
Thanks, Robert. Janine?
Thanks. Yeah, I also wanted to make a remark on the last bullet, the interrelationship with the tax planning project. So I think it's a logical topic when you're doing outreach that will pop up. And I also wanted to say that there are in several jurisdictions that I'm aware of already in their legislation requirements that are ethical requirements for leadership of audit firms, for policymakers and co-policy makers. So also there's a required governance body with specific tasks to look at the operations in audit firms more broadly. So that's also something that you can pick up on when you do your outreach activities. And I wanted to flag that Checho also want to raise a question. Thanks.
Thank you. Begonia.
Thank you. Oh, thank you very much, Gabriela, for the explanation about your current activities and projects. And my question is in some way linked with Robert's, and it's about this idea of having the profession agnostic code and widening the code to other professions. And in particular, when you are going to deal with this firm culture and governance, understanding firm in a wider way, not only accountants, but other non-accountants firms. So how are you planning to embrace these other professions in the project? I mean, are you planning to do it through outreach or having these other professionals in the task forces? I don't know. Is the board prepared or enough to consider which are the characteristics of these other potential professions that could be, well, mainly, I think, assuring sustainability, but other things as well. So I don't know, how can you get all the necessary views of these interested groups, because they should be those that will use later on the code, because that's the idea, no? To make it open to others.
And before you respond to all of this, and as we wrap up, let me just go to Tsecho. Tsecho, apologies. We can't, for some other reason, we can't see your face today when there's a presentation up. Maybe we can, in the break, we'll just see if we can sort it out. And therefore, we also can't see your hand. So over to you. Maybe just for your benefit, Gabriela, Tsecho needed to dial in, so she can't be with us today. That's why we're missing. Oh, there's your face. Thank you. Tsecho, finally we see you. Over to you.
Thanks, Chair. I was wondering why I wasn't called the first time around when we were discussing governance. My point is also on that last point that Janine raised, on the governance aspect. And I know that I observed the tax planning initial conversations but when the boards first kicked off the project. And in relation to the firm culture and governance, Gabriela, my question is around the naming convention itself. Wouldn't it have made sense to put governance before culture, given that governance is really the design and foundation of everything? And within there, you've got several aspects that fall under that, which then inform the principles of the firm, as well as how the leadership or the culture, or how the leadership should shape the culture within the firm. And when it comes to the tax planning aspect, I remember we talked about issues of things that are legal, but not necessarily moral or ethical. And therefore, it becomes a compliance issue rather than an ethical issue. And I guess as we are going on this outreach, we'll be getting a bit more insightful in terms of the conversation of what is ethical versus what compliance is. And obviously, that then affects the culture of any organization, including the employees therein. Those are just my two questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Tsehu. And back to you, Gabriela, if you want to respond to all of this and wrap up on the topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that part of these questions are not the same, but connected with the same topics. So I'm going to try to respond them together, and then if there are any doubts, of course, I'm available to respond and to explore further. So on how are we going to address the others who are not accountants? And I think that is a question, a common question for all of you. But one thing is tax planning, and the other thing is firm culture and governance. Although I'm the first one, it's there. To assume that there is a very, very close link between the two, and it's clear from the conversation that it always brings us back to firm culture and governance. But we have to think a little bit different on because these are two different projects and work streams. Also in terms of timing, when the tax planning work stream and project started, this idea of going beyond our boundaries, our traditional audience was not there, I think, or it was there, but I think that the step that we made with sustainability, with the help of the regulators, was critical to make us believe that we can do it and we should do it. So this is, as I said, one of the other critical strategic topics for the next cycle. On tax planning, it was clear to the board, and that discussion came very many times to the table, and Jens Paul was always insisting on that what is being done for professional accountants, and this is a standard for professional accountants, could be applicable and used by others. So we are encouraging the use of these standards by other providers of tax planning services. That's where we are today. In the future, it can be different, but again, that brings regulators in the ball. We can't mandate, we can't make it mandatory for consultants or lawyers or whatever, but we are in conversations with these groups, namely with the lawyers, through the IBA, good conversations, good interactions, and etc. They are very much interested in what we are doing. We spoke with Manal Corvin from OECD. She has a very clear vision about the differences between the two professions in terms of the respective frameworks and what can be needed, and etc. So the conversations are there, awareness as well, and the will, of course, the willingness of going in that direction, of course. But for the tax planning, for now, it is in nature a standard for professional accountants, can be used by anyone. On the firm culture and governance, of course, this is a little bit different because our vision and the scope and of the work stream is to work on something which is for the accounting firms, irrespective. It's not for the audit only, it's for accounting firms, irrespective of the services that they are providing. So whatever we are going to say, develop, etc., should cover any services being provided by and any activities and any people, members of accounting firms as a whole. So, but that's why the questions are important, because probably I did not explain it in a very clear way. So thank you for that. So the vision is wider than that. Then covering other consultants or others than the accounting firms, that's probably a different phase, a different step, although very many people would like to do it. And I think that compliance versus ethical, I think it was also, no, maybe Chego's question. Chego, the vision for the tax planning project is exactly to go beyond compliance. And that is, I think that that description of the gray area is that all the guidance that these standards provide and all the support is exactly to allow the providers to navigate the complexities of the gray area and to help them making decisions and the right choices when something can be possibly legal, but it's not ethical. So this is the aim of this project, is to help them embed ethical considerations and behaviors into areas where compliance may not be enough or may not be absolutely clear.
Thank you very much, Gabriella. Any last remarks or closing remarks from your side on sustainability or anything else as we wrap up?
Thank you very much.
You can't summarize in 3 minutes anything on that. I have one closing remark on that, but if there's anything that you want to flag or say on that, then let's just do that.
I don't think so. 30 seconds on sustainability. We are, of course, running our outreach on related with the exposure draft. And this is still early days because, as you know, the responses come on the very last day of the deadline, but it is important to understand that the feedback will not only come from the written responses, and given the diversity of stakeholders with which we are keeping good relationships, it is very clear that most of them will not take the time to write long letters, and they prefer to interact in a different way. So the webinars that we have already undertaken, there were a lot of global webinars, more local webinars with the United Nations, with the IESBA, with the, it was an incredible number of webinars that provided us already good feedback. Also, the outreach initiatives in Europe that we did earlier this last month or in February, and more recently in Canada, already allowed us to understand a little bit what stakeholders are saying, and in a very, very, very superficial way, I would say that there is a strong support, a very strong support to the proposal, with some specific issues where there are some doubts, not surprisingly, around value chain, the work of another practitioner, but I'd say that it's about some technicalities and not about the strategic option, and also on the scope, where there are some doubts about what it covers and what it should cover. So these are mostly the areas where we are getting some feedback, but the general support is very big, even on areas where we were not expecting, such as groups, where we were expecting a little bit of a pushback, and there will be, but what we got as of now was a very strong support for the idea of the IESBA advancing immediately on groups, because otherwise it would be another 5 years to get there, and we would leave such an important part of the reality outside of the scope of the standards that they would become irrelevant. With all the problems that this brings, we are aware of them. So that's it.
Thank you, James. Any comments from your side?
I'll close on how Tom closed to the PIOB in his session about the next 6 months. His was with respect to promoting sustainability. I'd encourage the PIOB and other stakeholders and our board as well, the importance over the next 6 months of a clear, unified signal of the public interest importance of the tax document on its own. I think that's very important. There is a lot going on in sustainability and culture. I think I call it a Star Trek standard. It goes where no man has gone before. And rightfully so, we should be confident in its mission. And of course, in due course, as always, we look to the effectiveness and the impact those standards have, but that will be in future years. So again, I think over the next, as the rollout slide, I'd encourage the PIOB and others to stand behind and promote the tax standards on its own. Thank you.
Thanks for that, James. The next 6 months will absolutely be important. The fact that we didn't discuss sustainability today, and when we agreed with Martin and myself, with Tom and Gabriella and James on the focus areas, it wasn't because it's not important, it's just because it's right there at the phase where you're considering the comment letters. It is of utmost importance for the standard to get in time for the European needs. Not that we write standards just for Europe, but these are global standards that you write, but it's a very, very important part of the world that you want to adopt the standard to make it actually globally usable and acceptable. So we wish you very well for the next 6 months. We know your board is going to spend a lot of time specifically on sustainability, which would probably take, I would imagine, priority above everything for the next 6 months or so to get the final standard out. The one comment that I will just add, and it came out of our preparation, and it's a comment that we made to Tom at the IESBA as well, is the absolute importance of coordination on everything, but very specifically on sustainability at this point in time. We have a slight concern that if there must be a closer move to how you get the definitions aligned as far as possible. We understand that there might be exceptions to that, but the different definitions for the same terminology is going to create lots of difficulty, and I know that's a theme that came through strongly through the comment process. So that's maybe the one comment that we, as the PIOB, would like to leave you with when it comes to sustainability. We wish you luck, we support it, we do believe it's really, really important, but please, just in the coordination and the alignment of definitions, I know there are processes in place to align that at the staff level and do some work on it, but it is really of critical importance, especially in such a new area. So with that, I'm going to close the session. We have just a little bit more than 10 minutes for a coffee break. I'll ask everybody to come back after the coffee break. We're going to have our public session in which we're going to deal with our approvals. So obviously, you're welcome to join us in the observer bench if you want to. Thank you, Gabriella. Thank you. We haven't really spoken to Ken much, but Ken, we know you're always there in the background to make sure that you answer any difficult questions. Thank you too for the work that's gone into it, and thank you, James, and especially to you, Gabriella. We will give you the feedback back if you're not here in any event, but you will get our official feedback too on the certification. Thank you, everybody. Can we return by 12:30? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll be here for sure.